Mama, for God's sake, please help me. They're going to take my children. He was a ghost standing in my doorway. Not the son I had raised, nor the cold, powerful tycoon he had become, but a third creature, a hollowed-out thing born from the wreckage of the other two. His $1,000 suit was wrinkled. His tie was gone. And his eyes, the same eyes that had once looked at me with such adoration, were wide with a terror so profound it seemed to steal the very air from my small apartment kitchen. A year before, he had stood in a marble foyer and told me I no longer fit into his life. Now here he was, on the worn welcome mat of the life he had banished me to, his entire world collapsing behind him. The only thing holding him up seemed to be the frame of my door, and the only word he could utter was the one he had tried so hard to forget. Mama. Ah, my dears. Before we step back in time to understand how a son's pockets could grow so large while his heart grew so small, I ask you for a moment of your time. If these stories of mine resonate with you, please do press that little like button and perhaps subscribe so you do not miss a single memory. It brings me such joy to know you are there. And please, do tell me in the comments what city you are listening from. It makes me feel as though we are all sitting together in one room, sharing these tales. Now let us return to the beginning. Before the regret. Before the fall. Let us return to the day the money came. It arrived like a bolt of lightning on a clear summer day. A phone call from a law firm in São Paulo. My late husband, Arthur, a man of quiet dreams and even quieter investments, had, on a whim in the 1980s, bought a handful of shares in a tiny, unknown technology startup. He had tucked the certificate away in a forgotten safe deposit box, a lottery ticket he never bothered to check. Decades later, that tiny startup had become a global behemoth, and that forgotten piece of paper was now worth an amount of money that seemed fictional. After taxes, David, as Arthur's sole heir to this particular investment, was the recipient of just over 500 million reais. The initial explosion was one of pure joy. We were all stunned, giddy with the sheer absurdity of it. I remember laughing until tears streamed down my face as David danced with his wife Brenda around my small, cozy living room. My other children, Eleanor, Samuel, Benjamin, were all there, celebrating their brother's impossible good fortune. For a few beautiful, fleeting weeks, the money was a miracle. It was a blessing from Arthur, a final gift from a good man who had only ever wanted to see his children secure. But money, I have learned, is a strange and powerful acid. At first, it simply polishes things, making them shine. But if you are not careful, it begins to corrode. The first change was the house. My comfortable, memory-filled home, where David and his siblings had grown up, was suddenly not enough. He bought a mansion, a great, white, sterile palace of glass and stone with more rooms than a hotel. The furniture was all sharp angles and cold leather. The art was abstract and chosen by a decorator. It had no scent of baking bread, no worn patches on the armchairs, no pencil marks on a doorframe charting the growth of a child. It was not a home. It was a statement. Then came the new friends, people with equally shiny houses and equally empty eyes. They talked of portfolios and acquisitions and legacy. The word legacy began to feature heavily in David's vocabulary. He was no longer just a man. He was the start of a dynasty. The first time I felt the true chill of the change was when he fired our family. Not in a literal sense, but in a spiritual one. He sat me down in his vast, echoing living room. He was not alone. A severe-looking woman with a sleek haircut, whom he introduced as his family wealth transition manager, sat beside him. Holding a tablet, "Mama," he began, his voice imbued with a new, corporate smoothness I did not recognize. "Brenda and I have been talking with Julia here about the future, about the brand of our family. We are building something that will last for generations." I remember just nodding, unsure of where this was going. And in that context, he continued, unable to meet my eyes, instead looking at Julia for reassurance. "We feel it's time to professionalize your position as well." "My position?" I asked, my heart beginning to grow cold. "David, I am your mother." "That is not a position. It is who I am." Of course, he said quickly. "But your lifestyle, your attachments, they belong to a different time. We want to secure your future, to take any burdens off your shoulders. We've found a wonderful exclusive retirement community for you. Top-of-the-line care. It's all paid for, a gift. And we will be selling your old house. It's an asset that needs to be properly managed now." He was firing me. He was using the language of a corporation to decommission his own mother. He was not sending me away. He was divesting himself of an outdated asset. I was a line item on a budget, a sentimental problem to be efficiently and generously solved. The pain of it was so sharp, so cold, it left me breathless. It was a betrayal more profound than any I had ever imagined, because it was delivered with a smile, gift-wrapped as an act of love. I looked at my son, this handsome stranger in his own home, and then at the woman beside him, the architect of my obsolescence. 1,000 memories screamed within me. The memory of kissing his scraped knee on the very spot where her expensive leather briefcase now sat. The memory of his frantic cries for me in the night. The memory of his hand in mine as we buried his father. These memories were the bedrock of my life, and they were being dismissed as inconvenient, sentimental clutter. I did not cry. I would not give them the satisfaction. I stood up, my old bones feeling every one of their years, and I smoothed the front of my dress. My dignity was the one asset they could not manage, the one thing I still owned outright. "Thank you for the presentation, Julia," I said, my voice as calm and steady as a frozen lake. "And David, thank you for clarifying my new position within the family brand." The words were polite, but they landed with the cold weight of iron. "You have given me much to consider." I turned and walked out of that cold marble hall without looking back. I felt their surprised eyes on me. They had expected tears, arguments, a dramatic scene. They had not expected a quiet, dignified exit. They had not expected a queen to simply abdicate rather than be overthrown. The drive back to my house, my old house as David had already mentally categorized it, was the longest of my life. Each familiar landmark, each tree, each crack in the sidewalk was a painful reminder of the life I was being evicted from. When I finally stood at my own front door, the solid worn wood warm beneath my hand, the tears came. I wept not just for the loss of my home, but for the loss of my son, a boy who had traded his heart for a portfolio. I did what I have always done in a crisis. I called my children. I summoned them to the living room, the very heart of the home that was now in dispute. As I told them what had happened, what David had said, the story sounded even more monstrous when spoken aloud. Benjamin, my gentle artist, simply began to weep, his face a portrait of pure, uncomprehending sorrow. His wife, Jessica, wrapped a protective arm around him, her own eyes blazing with a fury she rarely showed. Samuel, my complicated, envious son, surprised me. He let out a short, bitter laugh. "Of course," he said, shaking his head. "It's exactly what a weak man who has never earned a thing in his life would do. He's not a king, he's a terrified court jester who just stumbled onto a throne, and he's trying to banish anyone who remembers him in his fool's costume." But it was Eleanor who reacted with the force of a tidal wave. Her face, usually so controlled, was flushed with a deep, consuming rage.
"He did this with Julia Vance?"
she seethed. "She is a corporate butcher. She specializes in hostile takeovers, and that's what this is. He has allowed a stranger to execute a hostile takeover of our mother, of our family. This is not a financial decision. This is an act of war." They immediately began to plan my defense. Eleanor was already dialing her lawyer, ready to fight for the house. Benjamin and Jessica insisted I move in with them immediately. "This house is just wood and nails, Mama," Benjamin said. "Your home is with us." I was overwhelmed by their love, a warm and powerful shield against the coldness of David's betrayal. But I had to make my own choice. I had to show David, and perhaps more importantly, myself, that I was not a helpless old woman to be passed from one child to another. "There will be no lawsuit, Eleanor," I said firmly. "This is not a legal matter. This is a matter of the heart. You cannot sue a son for having a hollow one." To Benjamin I said, "And my darling boy, I will not move in with you." "Not yet. I will not be a burden." "You are never a burden," he insisted. "I know," I said, cupping his face, "but I must do this my way. I will not be managed. I will not be placed in a gilded cage of his choosing. I will find my own place, a small place, mine." And so my year of exile began. David, efficient as ever, sold my beloved house in a matter of weeks. I watched from a distance as my furniture, my memories, were carted away. True to my word, I used what little savings I had, and the money from my share of the furniture, to rent a small but pleasant apartment across town. My other children rallied around me. They helped me paint the walls. They filled the small rooms with flowers and their laughter. We created a new center for our family, a new harbor, smaller and humbler, but built on the unshakable foundation of loyalty and love. Of David, we heard nothing directly. We saw his new life in the society pages. David and Brenda at a charity gala. David and Brenda on a yacht in the Mediterranean. They were building their dynasty, brick by golden brick, on a foundation of his mother's discarded heart. For a full year, he was a ghost to us, a name in a magazine, a brother and a son who had simply ceased to exist. We built a new kind of normal, a normal with a gaping David-shaped hole in it. I mourned him as if he were dead. In many ways he was. And then, after a year of perfect, calculated, deafening silence, after I had finally begun to accept that the son I had raised was gone forever, there came a knock on the door of my small apartment, the knock that brought his world and that ghost crashing back into mine. The man who had dismissed me with the cool efficiency of a CEO now huddled on the floral print sofa of my small apartment, a coarse woolen blanket wrapped around his shoulders. I had pulled him inside from the storm of his own making, and now the silence in the room was broken only by his ragged breaths and the steady ticking of the grandmother clock in the corner, a clock I had managed to keep from the sale, a stubborn relic of a life he had tried to erase. I placed a glass of water on the small table beside him. His hands trembled so violently he could not lift it. I saw then the true depth of his unraveling. This was not just a man who had lost his money. This was a man who had lost his nerve, his pride, his very foundation. "Tell me everything, David," I said, my voice softer than I intended. "Start with the children. Are they safe?" That one question opened the floodgates. The story poured out of him, a toxic, jumbled confession of greed and breathtaking stupidity. His $500 million, he explained, had felt like a key that could open any door, but it had also felt like a burden. He was terrified of losing it, of being a one-time wonder. So, encouraged by his new wealthy friends and a slick financial advisor named Marcos, he didn't invest it safely. That was for old money, for timid people. He was a new titan, a visionary. He dove headfirst into high-risk, high-return ventures, speculative real estate in Dubai, volatile cryptocurrency schemes, a share in a guaranteed diamond mine in Africa. He was building his empire, turning millions into billions. The problem, he now sobbed, was that his new friends were not friends at all. They were predators. Marcos, his brilliant advisor, was a master artist, and my son was his canvas. He had convinced David to sign over power of attorney for offshore accounts, to invest in shell corporations that were designed to fail, to use his immense capital as leverage for loans that benefited everyone but him. They were bleeding him dry, all while clapping him on the back and calling him a genius. "I was a fool, Mama," he choked out, his face buried in his hands. "I wanted to be the smartest man in the room so badly that I became the biggest idiot." The money vanished faster than he had earned it. The diamond mine was a hole in the ground filled with worthless rocks. The cryptocurrencies evaporated. The Dubai towers were a mirage on paper. Within a year, the $500 million was gone, replaced by a mountain of debt and the chilling realization that he had been played. "But the children, David," I pressed gently. "Where do they fit in this?" His face, when he looked up at me, was a mask of pure terror. "The last deal," he whispered. "Marco said it was to recoup the losses. A private equity venture. He said we needed more collateral to show strength. He convinced me to leverage the trusts, the ones I had set up for the children's future." I felt the blood run cold in my veins. "The partners in the venture," he continued, his voice cracking. "They aren't like the others. They aren't just businessmen, Mama. They're dangerous. When the venture collapsed last week, they didn't call their lawyers. They called me. They said the debt is mine now, and they said that if I can't pay them, they will collect their collateral in other ways. They know where the children go to school." The room spun. My grandchildren, my innocent grandchildren, were now pawns in a dirty game played by criminals, all because of their father's arrogance. "Brenda?" I asked. The word sharp. "She's gone," he said, a fresh wave of despair washing over him. "When I told her, when she saw the threats, she packed her bags. She took the children to her parents' house in the south. She said she never wanted to see me again. She said I had destroyed them. She's right." He sat there, utterly alone, stripped of his wife, his children, his fortune, and his pride, the architect of a grand dynasty who had just lost his entire kingdom. He looked at me, his eyes pleading, the prodigal son in the final, desperate chapter of his own foolish parable. I listened to his entire sordid tale, and a strange, cold calm settled over me. The mother in me wept for the grandchildren and for the terrified man who was once my little boy. But the matriarch, the queen on the chessboard, saw the board for what it was. He had made a catastrophic move, and now he was begging me to save his king. I stood up and took the water from the table, holding it to his lips until he had taken a sip. His eyes never left my face, searching for a verdict. Forgiveness? Condemnation? You did not lose your money because you were a fool, David, I said, my voice even. You lost it because you were alone. You traded a family that loved you for a crowd that applauded you. And when the applause stopped, you were left with nothing. I walked to the telephone on the wall. My love for you as your mother is a fact. It exists like the ground beneath my feet. But the trust of your siblings, the respect of your family, that is a structure you burn to the ground. You cannot face these men alone. You are not strong enough. He looked up, confused. What are you doing? I am making my first and only condition, I said, picking up the receiver. My help, and the help of this family, is not a gift you can accept and then discard when you are powerful again. From this moment on, we are a family. All of us. You will hide nothing. You will pretend nothing. Your brokenness will be on this table for all of us to see, and we will decide how to move forward together. His face paled as he understood. You're calling them? Mama, no, I can't face them. Not Eleanor. Yes, I said, already dialing the number I knew by heart. You can. And you will. The phone began to ring. Eleanor, I said when my daughter answered. My voice was the calm at the center of the storm. It's David, he's here. He's in trouble. The kind of trouble that money started, but only a family can end. I need you to come. The sound of the doorbell was like a gavel calling a courtroom to order. One by one, my children arrived, stepping out of the rainy Pelotas night and into the charged, unnatural silence of my apartment. Eleanor came first, her face set like stone, a briefcase in her hand as if she were arriving for a hostile negotiation. Samuel followed, his expression grim and unreadable. Finally, Benjamin and Jessica, their faces a mirror of shared anxiety. They stopped in the entryway, their eyes landing on the figure huddled on my sofa. They saw not the brother who had betrayed them, but a stranger, a shipwreck of a man washed up on their mother's shore. For a moment no one spoke. The only sounds were the storm outside and the ticking of the clock, counting down the seconds of this terrible new reality. I was the one to break the silence. I stood and faced them, the matriarch calling her council of war. There will be no talk of the past tonight, I said, my voice leaving no room for argument. There will be no I told you so. What is done is done. All that matters now is that my grandchildren are in danger. David has made a terrible mistake, and he is going to tell you everything. You will listen. And when he is finished, we will decide as a family what is to be done. And so, for the second time that night, the story was told. To have to confess his folly to me was a humiliation for David. To have to repeat it, word for sordid word, to the siblings he had treated with such contempt was a profound and necessary penance. He did not spare himself. He detailed the foolish investments, the predatory advice from his so-called friends, the leveraging of his own children's futures, and the threats that now hung over their heads. As he spoke, I watched the faces of my other children. Samuel shook his head, a look of bitter disgust on his face, not at the lost money, but at the sheer, predictable weakness of it all. Benjamin looked physically ill, his artist's heart unable to process the cold-blooded nature of the men who were threatening his nieces and nephews. And Eleanor was terrifyingly still. She did not look at David with anger or pity. She looked at him like a problem, a complex and infuriating equation that she was determined to solve. When David's raspy voice finally fell silent, the room was thick with unspoken resentments and the raw horror of the situation. It was Eleanor who spoke first, her voice devoid of emotion. She was all business. Who are these men? She asked, her gaze fixed on David. I want their names. The name of the shell corporations. The banks they use. Every piece of data you have. Your shame is irrelevant right now. Facts are all that matter. Before David could answer, Samuel leaned forward, his voice a low growl. Men like that, Eleanor. Facts don't scare them. Lawyers don't scare them. They are not afraid of courts. He looked at David, a flicker of something other than resentment in his eyes. What have you given them that they can use as leverage against you? Beyond the children, what do they know? It was Benjamin, my gentle Benjamin, who brought the focus back to the true heart of the matter. We can figure out the men later, he said, his voice trembling slightly. Right now, tonight, Brenda and the children are alone at her parents' house. These people know where they are. We have to move them. We have to get them somewhere safe. I watched, my heart a painful mix of sorrow and pride. I had summoned them to help, and they were doing it. Each of my children, with their unique strengths, Eleanor's ruthless logic, Samuel's worldly pragmatism, Benjamin's compassionate heart, was a piece of the puzzle. The family, a thing David had tried to dissolve, was now his only hope. He's right, I said, and all eyes turned to me. That is the first step. Protecting the innocent. Eleanor, you will arrange it. Find a secure place, far from here. Samuel, you will help her. You understand the logistics of moving quietly. I then turned to David. You will give them everything they ask for. Your phone, your bank records, your pride. You will surrender it all to them. From this moment, you do not make decisions. Your family does. Do you understand? He looked at me, his eyes swimming with a gratitude so profound it was almost painful to witness. He nodded, unable to speak. His redemption had begun, not with an act of strength, but with an act of complete and total surrender. The days that followed were the longest our family has ever known. Eleanor, a general in her element, orchestrated the secret relocation of Brenda and the children to a quiet, secluded house on the coast, guarded by security she hired. Samuel used his connections to learn about the men who had threatened David, creating a file that gave Eleanor's legal team the leverage they needed. Benjamin and Jessica became the caretakers, not just for me but for the soul of our family, reminding us with their quiet strength what we were fighting for. It was a brutal, messy, and expensive war, fought not in courtrooms, but through back channels and high-stakes negotiations. David, true to his word, was a ghost at the center of it all, providing information, signing documents, and doing whatever was asked of him with a quiet, humble obedience. In the end, we did not recover the money. The fortune was gone, a phantom prize in a fool's game. But we achieved the only victory that mattered. Through a combination of legal threats and the kind of pressure Samuel was able to apply, the danger to my grandchildren was neutralized. The men, faced with exposure and the loss of their anonymity, retreated back into the shadows. Brenda, seeing the lengths to which David's family had gone to protect her children, and seeing the profound, humbling change in her husband, agreed to begin the slow, painful process of healing. David's dynasty is a small apartment not far from my own. He works for Samuel's company now, in an entry-level position, slowly paying back the immense debts he incurred. His journey is far from over, but every Sunday my children gather in my small living room. And when I look around the table, I see all of them. I see Eleanor, a little less controlling, a little more trusting. I see Samuel, a little less envious, a little more protective. I see Benjamin, his gentle heart intact. And I see David, a quieter, sadder, but infinitely better man. He lost 500 million reais, but in doing so, he found something he had never truly valued, a family that would walk through fire for him. And I, his mother, had lost a grand house but regained all of my children. It was, in the end, a fair trade. The sound of the doorbell was like a gavel calling a courtroom to order. One by one, my children arrived, stepping out of the rainy Pelotas night and into the charged, unnatural silence of my apartment. Eleanor came first, her face set like stone, a briefcase in her hand as if she were arriving for a hostile negotiation. Samuel followed, his expression grim and unreadable. Finally, Benjamin and Jessica, their faces a mirror of shared anxiety. They stopped in the entryway, their eyes landing on the figure huddled on my sofa. They saw not the brother who had betrayed them, but a stranger, a shipwreck of a man washed up on their mother's shore. For a moment no one spoke. The only sounds were the storm outside and the ticking of the clock, counting down the seconds of this terrible new reality. I was the one to break the silence. I stood and faced them, the matriarch calling her council of war. There will be no talk of the past tonight, I said, my voice leaving no room for argument. There will be no "I told you so." What is done is done. All that matters now is that my grandchildren are in danger. David has made a terrible mistake and he is going to tell you everything. You will listen, and when he is finished, we will decide as a family what is to be done. And so, for the second time that night, the story was told. To have to confess his folly to me was a humiliation for David. To have to repeat it, word for sordid word, to the siblings he had treated with such contempt was a profound and necessary penance. He did not spare himself. He detailed the foolish investments, the predatory advice from his so-called friends, the leveraging of his own children's futures, and the threats that now hung over their heads. As he spoke, I watched the faces of my other children. Samuel shook his head, a look of bitter disgust on his face, not at the lost money, but at the sheer, predictable weakness of it all. Benjamin looked physically ill, his artist's heart unable to process the cold-blooded nature of the men who were threatening his nieces and nephews. And Eleanor. Eleanor was terrifyingly still. She did not look at David with anger or pity. She looked at him like a problem, a complex and infuriating equation that she was determined to solve. When David's raspy voice finally fell silent, the room was thick with unspoken resentments and the raw horror of the situation. It was Eleanor who spoke first, her voice devoid of emotion. She was all business. "Who are these men?" she asked, her gaze fixed on David. "I want their names. The name of the shell corporations. The banks they use. Every piece of data you have. Your shame is irrelevant right now. Facts are all that matter." Before David could answer, Samuel leaned forward, his voice a low growl. "Men like that, Eleanor. Facts don't scare them. Lawyers don't scare them. They are not afraid of courts." He looked at David, a flicker of something other than resentment in his eyes. "What have you given them that they can use as leverage against you?" Beyond the children, what do they know? It was Benjamin, my gentle Benjamin, who brought the focus back to the true heart of the matter. "We can figure out the men later," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "Right now, tonight, Brenda and the children are alone at her parents' house. These people know where they are. We have to move them. We have to get them somewhere safe." I watched, my heart a painful mix of sorrow and pride. I had summoned them to help, and they were doing it. Each of my children, with their unique strengths, Eleanor's ruthless logic, Samuel's worldly pragmatism, Benjamin's compassionate heart, was a piece of the puzzle. The family, a thing David had tried to dissolve, was now his only hope. "He's right," I said, and all eyes turned to me. "That is the first step. Protecting the innocent. Eleanor, you will arrange it. Find a secure place, far from here. Samuel, you will help her. You understand the logistics of moving quietly." I then turned to David. "You will give them everything they ask for. Your phone, your bank records, your pride. You will surrender it all to them. From this moment, you do not make decisions. Your family does. Do you understand?" He looked at me, his eyes swimming with a gratitude so profound it was almost painful to witness. He nodded, unable to speak. His redemption had begun, not with an act of strength, but with an act of complete and total surrender. The days that followed were the longest our family has ever known. Eleanor, a general in her element, orchestrated the secret relocation of Brenda and the children to a quiet, secluded house on the coast, guarded by security she hired. Samuel used his connections to learn about the men who had threatened David, creating a file that gave Eleanor's legal team the leverage they needed. Benjamin and Jessica became the caretakers, not just for me but for the soul of our family, reminding us with their quiet strength what we were fighting for. It was a brutal, messy, and expensive war, fought not in courtrooms but through back channels and high-stakes negotiations. David, true to his word, was a ghost at the center of it all, providing information, signing documents, and doing whatever was asked of him with a quiet, humble obedience. In the end, we did not recover the money. The fortune was gone, a phantom prize in a fool's game, but we achieved the only victory that mattered. Through a combination of legal threats and the kind of pressure Samuel was able to apply, the danger to my grandchildren was neutralized. The men, faced with exposure and the loss of their anonymity, retreated back into the shadows. Brenda, seeing the lengths to which David's family had gone to protect her children, and seeing the profound, humbling change in her husband, agreed to begin the slow, painful process of healing. David's dynasty is a small apartment not far from my own. He works for Samuel's company now, in an entry-level position, slowly paying back the immense debts he incurred. His journey is far from over, but every Sunday my children gather in my small living room, and when I look around the table, I see all of them. I see Eleanor, a little less controlling, a little more trusting. I see Samuel, a little less envious, a little more protective. I see Benjamin, his gentle heart intact. And I see David, a quieter, sadder, but infinitely better man. He lost 500 million reais, but in doing so, he found something he had never truly valued, a family that would walk through fire for him. And I, his mother, had lost a grand house but regained all of my children. It was, in the end, a fair trade. Thank you, my dear friend, for staying with me through this tempestuous memory. It reminds us that our greatest treasures are not the things we can buy, but the hands that will catch us when we fall. If you have found meaning in our story, I would be so very grateful if you would like this video and subscribe to my channel. And please, do leave a comment to let me know your thoughts, but most importantly, tell me what you would like to remember next. Should we delve into the story of Eleanor to understand the roots of her fierce need for control? Or perhaps the story of Samuel, to uncover the source of the envy that has colored so much of his life? The choice, as always, is yours. Now let us speak of shadows. To understand Samuel, you must first understand the man who cast the shadow, my Arthur. In Pelotas, Arthur was more than a successful businessman. He was a pillar. His word was his bond, his handshake a contract more binding than any document. When he passed, the whole city mourned, not just for the man, but for the certainty he represented. He left us a legacy of impeccable integrity. To his other sons, this was a gift, a foundation upon which to build. But for Samuel, I see now, it was a monolith, a great stone monument he felt he could never measure up to. The roots of it were planted so early. I remember one autumn afternoon years ago. Arthur was in his workshop, the air thick with the sweet, sharp scent of cedar wood. He was teaching Benjamin, who was no more than 10, how to carve a small bird. His large, gentle hands would guide Benjamin's small ones, his voice a low, patient murmur. You see, my little artist, patience. You have the gift of patience. Samuel, a serious boy of 12, had come in holding one of his father's business ledgers. He had spent all afternoon trying to help, meticulously adding up columns of figures. "Papa," he said, his voice full of pride, "I found a mistake in the quarterly accounting. Just a small one, but I corrected it." Arthur, without looking away from the delicate carving, reached out and ruffled Samuel's hair. "Good boy, Samuel. Don't you worry about these dusty old books. This isn't your strength. Go on now, run outside." It was not a cruel dismissal. In Arthur's mind, he was freeing his son to be a child. But what I saw, what Samuel felt, was a door quietly closing. Benjamin was the little artist. David, even then, was the charismatic heir. And Samuel? He was the practical, reliable one. The one who was praised for his effort, but never for a gift. He was the son his father loved, but not the one his father saw. This quiet ache solidified in him over the years. He grew into a competent man, a decent businessman, but he was always Arthur's son, never his own man. He watched as David's star rose and fell and rose again, always dramatic, always the center of attention. He watched as Benjamin received quiet acclaim for his art, his soul's work. Samuel's work was just work. It was the solid, unglamorous prose in a family of poetry and drama. The breaking point began with an opportunity. A group of developers approached him with a grand vision to revitalize a derelict section of the city's waterfront. It was a massive, ambitious project, the kind of legacy-defining work that could finally make Samuel a name that stood on its own. But there was a problem. The project required an immense amount of initial capital, and the biggest investors were hesitant. Samuel's own reputation was solid, but it wasn't enough to inspire that level of confidence. He was a safe bet, not a visionary. He confessed his frustrations to me one evening. And then, a week later, he came to dinner with a strange, feverish light in his eyes. He said he had found a solution. He had secured the funding. I was so happy for him, so relieved to see him excited, that I did not ask the questions I should have. I did not see the desperation behind the smile. What I did not know was what happened in the meeting with his new partners. They had offered him a devil's bargain. "Your personal finances are not the issue, Samuel," the lead developer, a slick man named Marius, had told him. "But your name doesn't carry the weight we need." Arthur's name, however, that still opens every door in this city. The proposal was simple. Samuel would remain the public face of the project. But in the private partnership agreements, they would list the Arthur Family Legacy Trust as a silent, non-financial partner. It was just a name on a paper, Marius had assured him, a gesture of confidence. They would be using not his money but the idea of his father as collateral. It was the ultimate temptation. The very name that had overshadowed him his entire life was now the key to his liberation. To use the shadow to create his own light. It was a betrayal of everything his father stood for, all in the name of proving he was worthy of being his father's son. In that quiet, mahogany paneled office with the ghosts of his father's principals watching him. My son Samuel picked up a pen, and with a heart full of a lifetime of perceived inadequacy and a desperate, burning hope to finally be seen, he signed the deal. He signed his father's good name away. For a time, it seemed as though Samuel's gamble had paid off. The first few months were a golden season of success. The waterfront revitalization project, with Samuel as its handsome, confident face, was the talk of Pelotas. Architects were hired, impressive blueprints were unveiled in the local newspaper, and the city's elite, who had once seen Samuel as merely the quiet son of a great man, now looked at him with a new respect. He changed. The quiet, contained man was replaced by someone more expansive, more confident. He bought a sleek, dark German car. He started wearing suits that were tailored a little sharper, a little more modern than his father would have ever approved of. He was stepping out of the shadow, and for a moment, the light seemed to suit him. He hosted a dinner for the family at a lavish restaurant downtown, a place of starched white tablecloths and glittering chandeliers. It was there he officially announced the project to all of us. He spread the architectural drawings across the table, his hands moving over them with a proprietary grace. He spoke of vision, of legacy, of building a new future for our city. I remember looking around the table at my other children. Benjamin, my artist, was full of sincere admiration for the sheer scale of the vision. Even Eleanor, my pragmatist, was impressed by the thoroughness of the plans. And David, in his new, quieter, post-fall humility, looked at his brother with what I can only describe as genuine pride. "You're doing it, Sam," David said, raising his glass. "You're building something real. Papa would be so proud." I saw Samuel's face in that moment. That praise, from the brother who had always effortlessly held the spotlight, was something he had craved his entire life. But I saw something else in his eyes, too, a flicker of deep, profound unease. The praise felt hollow to him, I realize now, because he knew it was built on a lie. He smiled and accepted the toast, but he was a man celebrating on a stage he knew was about to collapse. The first cracks in the facade began as hairline fractures. A crucial building permit was held up in a mire of bureaucracy. An early-phase contractor complained of a delayed payment. "Small things," Samuel assured me when I asked. "The growing pains of any big project, Mama. Don't you worry." But the changes in him were more telling than his reassurances. He stopped coming for Sunday dinners, always citing a last-minute meeting. When I would call him, the confident energy in his voice was gone, replaced by a strained, brittle exhaustion. The dark circles under his eyes were becoming permanent fixtures. The matriarch in me, the mother, knew something was deeply wrong. I tried to press him once, my hand on his arm. "Samuel, you seem to carry the weight of the world. Talk to me." He pulled away gently, a flicker of panic in his eyes. "It's just business, Mama. It's complicated." "You wouldn't understand." He had never said that to me before. He was building a wall around himself, and I, choosing to believe it was the stress of his newfound success, allowed him to. I chose silence when perhaps I should have intervened. It is a choice I still regret. The truth, as I learned later, was that his dream was already becoming a nightmare. His slick partner, Maurice, was becoming evasive. The promised next stages of funding were always just a week away. The stories kept changing. The investors were in Singapore, in Dubai. They were restructuring. They were finalizing terms. Samuel was pouring his own money into the project to cover the short-term debts, to stop the cracks from widening, believing Maurice's promises that the flood of capital was just over the horizon. He discovered the full, horrifying truth on a Tuesday afternoon in October. A certified letter arrived at his office from a lending house he had never heard of. It was a notice of default on a multi-million real loan, a loan he had never signed for. When he called Maurice, frantic, the man's voice was no longer smooth and reassuring. It was cold. "It's just business, Samuel," Maurice told him, throwing my son's own words back at him. It was then that the whole rotten structure was revealed. There were no long-term investors from Dubai. Maurice and his partners had used the unimpeachable reputation of the Arthur Family Legacy Trust to secure a series of massive, predatory loans. The plan was never to build anything. It was to take the loan money, bleed the project dry with fraudulent invoicing to their own shell companies, and then vanish, leaving Samuel responsible. The lawsuit wouldn't just be against Samuel. The lenders would sue the Arthur Family Legacy Trust. They would drag my husband's name through the mud, claiming he was party to a fraudulent enterprise. The public shame, the destruction of his father's honor, that was the true collateral. Samuel sat in his office, the world dissolving around him. He had not stepped out of his father's shadow. He had chained himself to a corpse he had created and thrown it into the abyss. He had sought to make a name for himself and had, instead, managed only to destroy the one name that had ever mattered. The final, devastating blow came in the form of a phone call. It was one of the lenders, a cold, flat voice informing him that since the first default notice had been ignored, they were proceeding with a public filing in 2 days. The story would be on the front page of every newspaper in the state by the weekend. My husband Arthur, the pillar of the community, would be posthumously branded a fraud. Samuel hung up the phone. He was financially ruined, but that was a distant, insignificant pain. The only thing he could see, the only thing he could feel, was the profound, soul-crushing weight of his failure. He had gambled with a ghost and he had lost everything. There was nowhere to run. There was no one to turn to. There was only one door left to knock on, the one he had spent his whole life trying to escape, and the only one that might still open for him. Mine. The scene that played out in my living room was not the one I had braced myself for. It was not a tense negotiation with angry lenders. It was something quieter, heavier, and infinitely more strange. I led my son inside, my arm around his trembling shoulders. The 2 men followed, their expressions not of aggression, but of a deep, somber gravity. They sat on the edges of their chairs, placing their briefcases on the floor. I summoned my other children. The hour was late, but my voice on the phone conveyed an urgency that they all heeded without question. They arrived one by one, their faces a mixture of confusion and alarm, to find their brother a broken man and 2 strangers waiting in our midst. When we were all assembled, the older of the 2 men, a man with graying temples and his father's weary eyes, finally spoke. His name was Elias Becker. "Mrs. Moretti," he said, his voice respectful, "we are not here about your son's recent business venture. Not directly. We are not his lenders. To be honest, we do not care about his money." He paused, his gaze sweeping over my children before landing back on me. "We are here about a debt that is much, much older. A debt left unpaid by your husband." A profound silence filled the room. Eleanor stiffened, ready to defend our father's honor. "My father had no debts," she said, her voice like ice. Mr. Becker looked at her, his expression not of anger, but of a deep, abiding sadness. "With respect, ma'am, he had one. A moral one. Our grandfather, Henrique Becker, was your father's first business partner back in the 1950s. Together, they built a small construction company from nothing. But in a moment of crisis, when the company was on the verge of collapse, your father made a choice. He used a legal loophole to dissolve the partnership, pushing our grandfather out and leaving him with all of the debt and public ruin. Arthur took the remaining assets, rebranded, and built the company that made his name. He built his legacy on the ashes of our families. He opened his briefcase and laid a series of faded, yellowed letters on the coffee table. Our father and grandfather spent their lives trying to restore their good name. We are not here for money. We are here for the truth. Your son's failed project by publicly invoking the Arthur Family Legacy Trust brought this old wound back to the surface. It is time for it to be set right." My children were stunned, looking at the letters as if they were venomous snakes. It was an attack on our family's very creation myth, on the sainted memory of their father. "This is slander," Eleanor whispered, her voice trembling with rage. All eyes turned to me. They were looking for their matriarch to rise in defense, to banish these men and their lies. But I could not, because they were not lies. I looked at the faces of my children, and then at the face of my broken Samuel, and I knew the time for silence was over. "It is the truth," I said, the words feeling like stones in my mouth. A collective gasp filled the room. "It was the one great shame of your father's life. He was a young man, desperate not to fail. He made a ruthless choice. He spent the rest of his life trying to become the man of integrity you all knew, perhaps to atone for the one time he was not. He never had the courage to face what he had done to Henrique Becker." The revelation shattered the room. But in the wreckage, something surprising happened. I looked at Samuel. The source of his lifelong pain, the perfect, monolithic shadow of his father, had just cracked. His father was not a giant of impossible integrity. He was a man, a flawed, frightened man who had made a terrible mistake and spent his life running from it. And in that moment, Samuel saw his own reflection not as a failure, but as a continuation. He too was a flawed man who had made a terrible mistake in the shadow of his father's name. He stood up. The trembling was gone. His voice when he spoke was clear and steady. He looked not at me, but at Elias Becker. "You are right," Samuel said. "A debt must be paid." He then turned to his siblings. "I did this. My foolish ambition, my envy. It brought this to our door, but it is not a curse. It is an opportunity." "An opportunity for what?" Eleanor asked, bewildered. "Public disgrace?" "No," Samuel said, a strange new light in his eyes. "An opportunity for the truth. I spent my whole life trying to live up to a myth. The most honest way I can honor my father now is to admit that he was a man, not a myth. And so am I. His redemption was not what any of us could have expected. He did not fight a legal battle to save the family name. He did the opposite. He worked with the Becker family. Together they issued a public statement. It told the whole story. It began with Samuel's own failed waterfront project, his confession of using his father's name as collateral. But then it went deeper. It told the story of Arthur and Henrique Becker, of a youthful mistake and its lifelong consequences. It was a radical, painful act of public honesty. The result was astonishing. The city was not scandalized. It was moved. The story was not one of disgrace, but of a son's courage and a family's willingness to face a difficult truth. The Arthur Moretti legacy was not destroyed. It was transformed from a cold stone monument into a complex human story of failure, atonement, and eventual truth. The predatory lenders, faced with a narrative they could not control, quietly faded away. Samuel did not become a tycoon. He works as a modest project manager now. But the envy is gone. The weight of the shadow has been lifted, not by outrunning it, but by turning to face it and understanding its source. He is finally simply Samuel, and it is more than enough. My dears, thank you for walking this difficult, surprising path with me. It teaches us, I think, that our legacies are not written in the flawless stories we tell, but in the courage with which we face our imperfect truths, as always. The warmth of your presence here means the world to me. A like, a subscription, a comment telling me where you are in the world. These are the small kindnesses that keep these memories alive.